in Libya are set for 5 p.m. Eastern today. Congressional Quarterly reporting that debate could last through the rest of this week. The bipartisan legislation crafted by Massachusetts Democrat John Kerry and Arizona Republican Senator John McCain. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Spirit, our guardian and guide, deepen our trust in your will and your purposes. Lord, use our lawmakers as diligent partners in doing your will on earth. May they not lose heart or become discouraged because of the daunting problems they must solve, but each day may they resolve to faithfully labor to please you. Help them to be good stewards of the gifts you have given by striving for peace and justice, sacrificing for the needy, and transcending differences for the sake of the common good. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 5, 2011. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Jim Webb, a senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
President.
Majority Leader.
Following any leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 20. At 5 p.m. today, the Senate will vote on the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to the Libya Resolution. This vote will be longer than usual to accommodate senators returning after the holiday, which occurred yesterday. But that doesn't mean it'll be open forever. We'll be happy to be a little lenient, but we'll do the best we can on that. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that John Daly, who is detailed to the Foreign Relations Committee from the State Department, be granted privileges of the floor for the duration of the debate on Senate Joint Resolution 20.
Without objection, so ordered.
In one of his poems, T.S. Eliot wrote, "Hurry up, please. It's time." He could have been writing about us here in the United States Senate. Yesterday, this great nation celebrated its 235th birthday. In those 235 years, we've accomplished many admirable things, and we've done it together. We've landed on the moon, invented new ways to save lives, fought democracy and freedom all around the world. But now we stand poised to make a different kind of history. For the first time, the United States of America stands at the brink of defaulting on our financial obligations. The chief economist for the United States Chamber of Commerce has said allowing America to default on the debt, quote, would be tantamount to writing a bad check, end of quote. But unless we take action, tarnishing this great nation's sterling reputation will be the least of our concerns. We also risk the very fate of this country's economy and the world's economy along with it. The last time this country was plunged into a major recession, just 3 short years ago, we took the world with us. When Wall Street Greed caused a near collapse of our financial system. Americans across the country lost their jobs, their homes, and their savings. And so did people across the globe. This country is only beginning to recover, and the world with us. But the crisis we face now is one of even greater proportion. Without exception, the most respected economists and business minds of our time have said that if America defaults on its debt, it will have the dire consequences here and around the world. Catastrophe, they've called it. That same U.S. Chamber of Commerce economist said a failure to avert this crisis is, quote, not a possibility, end quote. He could not even conceive that Republicans in Congress would shirk their duty. Defaulting on our debt would risk millions of American jobs. It could halt tax refunds, Social Security checks, Medicare payments, and even paychecks for our troops. And the depression it would cause here at home would ripple around the globe. Some have suggested that instead of getting Social Security checks, Social Security recipients would get an IOU from the federal government. This default crisis is not a new problem. It's been around for months. But we no longer have months or even weeks to avert this catastrophe. We have days. Yet my Republican colleagues have walked away from the negotiating table when we're nearing a solution and so close to disaster. Why? To protect oil companies, to protect the owners of yachts and corporate jets, to protect corporations that ship jobs overseas, to protect millionaires and billionaires from paying their fair share. 20% of all the income earned in this nation is earned by less than 1% of its citizens. It's this top, approximately 1%, that Republicans are determined to protect. Republicans walked away from the negotiations to protect them. Meanwhile, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And the middle class Democrats have worked to make stronger is disappearing. Middle class families are struggling to make ends meet. That's why I brought to the floor legislation demanding millionaires and billionaires contribute their fair share to this crucial deficit reduction struggle. When Republicans talk about shared sacrifice, they mean the sacrifice should be shared by those who can least afford it. Democrats believe the sacrifice should be shared by the richest as well. The others have all sacrificed too much already. As we debate this in the United States Senate this week, negotiations with the Vice President and the President should continue. The invitation to Republicans to help prevent a catastrophic default remains open. To become part of the solution rather than part of the problem, all Republicans have to do is accept our invitation. The time is here for my Republican colleagues to put politics aside. Simply put, we're out of time. But Democrats can't negotiate with ourselves. When one side comes to the table and the other refuses, it's impossible to negotiate. So this week, we'll debate the solution to this crisis, whether Republicans like it or not. Democrats will be clear about what's at stake, really the fate of our country and the global economy. We will be clear about our priority to avert a catastrophic default and protect our fragile economic recovery. And we'll be clear about the middle ground we've already found. We must cut the deficit to get our fiscal house in order. Democrats are willing to compromise, but compromise does not mean allowing our Republican colleagues to put the wants of a few millionaires and billionaires ahead of the needs of this nation and the world. I repeat the words of T.S. Eliot. Hurry up, please. It's time.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
When we subsequently go into morning business, I ask that speakers on the Republican side be limited to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President, Washington is engaged in a debate right now over the kind of country we want to be. The specific issue is this. At some point over the next several weeks, the federal government will no longer be able to borrow the money it needs to cover the cost of promises it's already made. So the President wants Congress to raise the statutory debt limit set by Congress. He wants us to raise the limit on the national credit card. Now, what Republicans have said is that the only way we'll do it is if Democrats agree to change their ways. so we don't end up with the kind of situation that we're witnessing over in Greece. And make no mistake, that's exactly where we're headed if we don't do something significant and do it now. Democrats so far have refused. Instead, they're making what can only be described as a bizarre request under the circumstances. In the middle of what we all agree is a debt crisis, they would like to spend even more. They want a second stimulus, more deficit spending. In the middle of a jobs crisis, they want to raise taxes that we know will kill even more jobs, when even the President has said that raising taxes would leave job creators with less ability to hire. These are their solutions. This is what the President came off the campaign trail to defend last Thursday. And this is what Republicans oppose. Our view is that the way you solve a debt crisis is to go on a diet, not a shopping spree. Our view is that the way to create jobs is to make it easier for businesses to hire, not harder. And frankly, we don't think the voters sent a wave of Republicans to Washington last November because they wanted us to raise taxes. They sent us here to restore some sanity. But the President and his Democratic allies in Congress don't seem to get it just yet. Right now, they're calling for a tax on aircraft manufacturers because they think it's good politics. It's their cheap attempt at trying to make anybody who opposes it look bad. What they forgot is that many of them voted to repeal a similar tax on the same industry during the Clinton administration because of the devastating effect it had on jobs. They made the same arguments then, that we need to raise taxes on luxury goods to get more money, and it backfired. The shipbuilding industry alone lost tens of thousands of jobs. Now, our Democratic colleagues surely must remember this. But apparently they'd rather have fun trying to caricature their political opponents than they would working out a bipartisan solution that would actually enable us to balance the books. Here's the point. Washington needs to find a way to spend less. Taxing more is their easy way out. They'll start with aircraft manufacturers. Then when that's enough, and it never is, it's some other industry, then another. And before you know it, you're going after absolutely everybody. Why? Because it's easier to find villains and excuses than it is to make tough choices. But most Americans know what it's like to make tough choices. And they want to know, if they have to do it, why can't Washington? That's why I invited the President over here last Thursday to talk with Republicans. My hope, as I made clear, was that he would listen to Republicans and hear firsthand why we think raising taxes in a weak economy is a bad idea and what the realities are over here. My goal, as I said on Thursday, was to get together and talk about what's actually possible. The Obama administration said it wasn't a conversation worth having. Republicans in Congress believe that finding a way to reduce the deficit and put Medicare on more secure footing is a conversation worth having. So today I'd like to re-extend the offer. I think the best way to solve this impasse is for the President to hear what needs to be done and how we can do it, hear what can actually pass here in Congress. He needs to understand the principles at stake here from our point of view. It's not about rich and poor. It's not about an election. It's about making Washington take the hit for a change. It's about having Washington make some tough choices for a change. Americans want to see accountability here in Washington. They've seen Democrats spending trillions of dollars we don't have. And they've seen the economic situation get worse in many respects than it was several years ago, and the facts speak for themselves. Since the President took the oath of office, nearly 2 million more people are unemployed. That's a 17% increase in the unemployment rate under President Obama. Gas prices have nearly doubled, up 86% since January of 2009. In the past 2 years, the federal debt has increased 35%. Debt per person has increased by over $11,000. Health insurance premiums for working families have shot up 19%. And while home values across the country have declined by 12%, they've clearly made the economy worse. Americans get this. They think Washington needs to either find a way to pay its bills or scale back its commitments, just like everybody in the country does. Americans have made enough sacrifices the past 2 years. It's time for Washington to learn to make some sacrifice of its own. So hopefully the President will agree that reducing the debt is indeed a conversation worth having. I think we can do it. But I think he needs to understand what the legislative realities are and why. And we're committed to a result that will restore the people's confidence, not only in our economy, but in our government. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I understand you're about to have the clerk report a motion to proceed.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 20, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to the consideration of S.J. Res. 20, a joint resolution authorizing the limited use of the United States Armed Forces in support of the NATO mission in Libya.
Tim. Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I withdraw my motion to proceed to count number 88, S.J. Res. 20.
The motion is withdrawn.
I now move to proceed to count number 93, S. 1323.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 93 S 1323, a bill to express assent to the Senate on shared sacrifice in resolving the budget deficit.
I have a cloture motion at the desk in that regard, Mr. President.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 93 S 1323, a bill to express assent to the Senate on shared sacrifice in resolving the budget deficit, signed by 17 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Durbin, Schumer, Lautenberg, Franken, Rockefeller, Reed of Rhode Island, Whitehouse, Brown of Ohio, Sanders, Kerry, Merkley, Stabenow, Akaka, Inouye, Leahy, and Cardin.
Mr. President, I ask consent the mandatory requirement of Rule 22 be waived.
Without objection, so ordered.
I now withdraw my motion to proceed to calendar number 93, S. 123.
The motion is withdrawn.
I now move to proceed to calendar number 88, S.J. Res. 20.
The motion is before the Senate.
Mr. President, I ask consent that the time until 5 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or the designees. Any time spent in quorum call be equally divided. And there's already an order in effect that Republicans will be limited to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered.
President,
Senator Morgan.
ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, international trade is one of the best ways to create more good-paying jobs for our people, as long as our workers and our companies are treated fairly in the tough global markets they compete in. That is not the case today. Chinese trade chiefs, after being found guilty of dumping their goods in America, now launder these goods by illegally shipping them through Korea and other countries. This illegality is undercutting our workers, undercutting our companies, and is driving hardworking Americans out of jobs. And all of this is taking place, Mr. President, under the sleepy eyes of America's so-called trade enforcement agencies. Because this trade ripoff is growing, and the United States Senate will soon take up trade agreements that could fix this problem, I want to take just a few minutes this afternoon to make clear how this scam actually works. The reason I have this information is because, as chairman of the Senate Finance Subcommittee on International Trade, my staff set up a dummy company that intervened directly with suppliers in China in order to learn firsthand how the Chinese firms brazenly shirk America's trade laws. First, what happens, Mr. President, is the U.S. Department of Commerce, after a thorough and substantial investigation, imposes anti-dumping duties on certain Chinese merchandise that was shown to be dumped, which is to say the merchandise is being sold at below market prices. The next thing that happens is the Chinese supplier of the merchandise that was tagged with the anti-dumping duties, rather than stop selling at dump prices into the U.S., the Chinese essentially shore up their American buyers by soothingly conveying that these duties are not going to impact their prices. The suppliers sometimes characterize complying with U.S. trade law as merely a political issue. After that, the Chinese goods are shipped into Korea, for example, where the goods are repacked into boxes that say "Made in Korea." The documentation then follows the merchandise that is also going to be altered or forged to suggest that the merchandise indeed originates in Korea rather than China. From there, the merchandise enters into our country, often at the port of Long Beach in California, and U.S. Customs officials declare the goods to not be subject to anti-dumping duties because, purportedly, if you look at all the labeling, they don't originate in China. This transshipment, Mr. President, is laundering. Laundering, plain and simple. And it is a ripoff of the American worker. My concern is once the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement goes into force, Korea would become a super magnet for this kind of merchandise laundering. Why would any Chinese supplier launder merchandise through Singapore, for example, when doing so through Korea would bless their merchandise with the duty-free status that the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement provides? The answer, Mr. President, is obvious. They wouldn't. That's why the Congress needs, through legislation, to send clear instruction to the Bureau of Customs and Border Protection. And these are our cops. They're the commercial cops at America's ports. They need to be instructed about how to identify and combat the evasion of America's trade laws. And my view is this is absolutely critical to ensuring that the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement is not a tool that further empowers unscrupulous Chinese exporters. Now, for almost a century, our trade laws, the anti-dumping and the countervailing duties, have been enforced by Democratic and Republican administrations. They represent the frontline defense that protects our American workers. They're the laws that protect our businesses and our families from unfair and unscrupulous trade practices employed by foreign competition. But what we are seeing around the country, Mr. President, is that these anti-dumping and countervailing duties are being evaded, and the problem is growing. What we have seen is it takes years for the government to look into and conclude investigations of merchandise laundering. During this period of foot-dragging, our companies get hammered by the foreign trade cheats, and when the cheats get caught, the enforcement agencies have almost never taken the steps necessary to ensure that the duties that are owed are actually collected. The discrepancy between how much the U.S. government is owed by these foreign trade cheats and how much is actually collected is embarrassing, Mr. President. We're collecting something on the order of 20% of what is owed to our government, and that's only from the companies that actually got caught and were prosecuted. The fact is there are many more that are missed every year. So, Mr. President, I hope colleagues, as we go to the trade debate here, understand that the point of trade agreements is that it's possible to export more of our goods and services around the world. What we want in trade agreements is to grow things here, we want to make things here, we want to add value to them here, and we want to ship them somewhere. So we want to export our goods and services, not export our jobs. But unfortunately, again and again, as a result of our competitors evading the trade laws, we've got a broken enforcement process, Mr. President. That is why 3 Democrats here in the United States Senate and 3 Republicans in the United States Senate have joined me in introducing a piece of legislation that puts the teeth back in our trade laws. Senator Snowe and Blunt and McCaskill and Brown and Portman and Schumer and I all joined together, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, in introducing S1133. This legislation requires Customs to quickly and transparently investigate duty evasion. It requires the Customs agency to use existing law to ensure that it can collect the correct duties on merchandise. The legislation requires Customs to appropriately share this information with other federal agencies, because we have seen again and again that often one of the agencies doesn't talk to the other. And finally, it requires the appropriate agencies to make sure that in the future they're going to report to the Congress promptly on what is being done to fully address the problem. Let me wrap up, Mr. President. I see colleagues on the floor by simply saying that I believe trade agreements create more jobs for our people. But the fact is, trade agreements without enforcement can cost our people jobs. So this time, as the Congress goes forward considering trade legislation, it's important to show the American people that as our trade agenda moves forward and moves forward aggressively, that in the days ahead, instead of major trade competitors laundering merchandise, as we have seen in our committee's investigation to avoid the trade laws, our trade laws would finally be fully enforced. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I understand I have 10 minutes to speak on the resolution before us.
Senator's correct.
Mr. President, if you'd let me know if I speak 8 minutes or longer, when I have 2 minutes left, I'd appreciate it.
And I wonder if my colleagues from Tennessee
Mississippi
will yield on this time.
Yes, sir. It's my understanding you'd like to speak for 2 minutes.
I appreciate that. Mr. President and my colleagues, this weekend a local newspaper in Mississippi ran a lead editorial that wondered aloud whether the cancellation by the Senate of the Independence Day recess signaled a, quote, serious effort on the part of Senate leaders, unquote, and the White House to make headway in addressing the federal debt. Regrettably, the answer to that question is obviously no. And for that reason, I want to announce at this point that I will be voting no this afternoon on the motion to invoke cloture, on the motion to proceed to a debate on Libya. Clearly, Libya is an important issue. I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. I have the greatest of respect for both my chairman and the ranking member, but I would remind colleagues what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said recently. The most important national security issue facing the United States of America is the national debt. And we should not move to a vote on Libya and to a discussion on Libya, which frankly is almost academic at this point, until we debate the crucial issue facing the United States Senate, and that's the issue of the national debt. If we had a serious effort to talk about the national debt. In this week of recess that has been canceled, we would be convening the Budget Committee today and asking them to report a budget on the floor for the first time in almost 800 days so that we could have a debate on the floor about the budget. If the Senate majority...
The Senator has used 2 minutes.
Could I have another minute?
Without objection.
If the Senate majority were serious about their efforts to reduce the federal debt, the administration would not be continuing its efforts to spend our way to prosperity. We would be bringing to the floor a budget to cut spending, to make a serious effort against these huge federal deficits that we're seeing. We wouldn't be engaging in the politics of fear. We wouldn't be engaging in the politics of class warfare. We would be getting to business this week. I hope that's what we will do. The only way I know to get to that debate is to vote no on the motion for cloture this afternoon. I think a number of my colleagues will be doing so. If some 41 of us can muster a no vote on the motion to invoke cloture, then we can have the debate on Libya at another time, and we can get today and this week to the one and only reason that we are back in town, and that is this debt that consumes us, that threatens our national security, our national well-being, and that we are called upon to debate by our colleagues and our constituents. And I thank my friend from Tennessee for yielding.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I thank the Senator from Mississippi for his comments. Mr. President, as I mentioned, I rise to speak about S.J. Resolution number 20. I think there's been some misinformation about what we're doing this afternoon. I know the presiding officer and I were in a Foreign Relations Committee meeting last week. I offered several amendments that were not passed. But many people have said that what we're going to be debating possibly this evening, I hope that we don't, is something that the President has asked for. Mr. President, or presiding officer, I know knows differently. The President did not ask for what it is we're going to be debating this evening. The President earlier asked for a resolution of support, but not an authorization for this third war that we're undertaking right now in Libya. That is not what the President asked for. As a matter of fact, the President, in a very cutely worded letter to Congress, tried to state that we were not involved in hostilities in Libya. And he did so in order to circumvent a law that's been on the books now for many years called the War Powers Act. And so the President is not seeking what the Senate is getting ready to debate on the floor at all. As a matter of fact, the President is trying to circumvent the War Powers Act. And so there's no question, in my opinion, that the President should be made to seek authorization. But then that brings us to the issue at hand. Mr. President, there is no way that anything we do on the Senate floor other than possibly pulling our troops out of Libya, which is not what this resolution is about, is going to affect anything we're doing in Libya one iota. Let me say that one more time. If the resolution that we're debating possibly this evening were to actually be debated and passed, it would not affect one iota of what we're doing in Libya. The fact is, the House has already turned down the same resolution. So basically, we're burning a week's time on something that is totally irrelevant to what is happening in Libya, and certainly irrelevant as it relates to what is before us as a country. As the Senator from Mississippi just mentioned, the biggest issue facing our country today is this issue of the debt ceiling and our debt. The fact that we have $14.2 or $3 trillion in indebtedness, and we're moving beyond that. The fact that we have $1.5 trillion in deficits this year. The fact that we are spending $3.7 trillion and only have $2.2 trillion. The fact that we are borrowing 40 cents of every dollar that we spend every day that we're here, and that 47% of that is coming from people overseas. That is the most important issue before us. That is the reason that we're back here this week during July recess. And I'm glad that we're here, But we need to focus on the issue at hand. Just to speak to how dysfunctional the United States Senate is, we're here over the debt ceiling. We're here over the fact that we have huge deficits and we don't have an agreement to deal with that. But instead of focusing on the issue at hand, which is what most people back in Tennessee or Virginia or some other place would do if they had a problem, we're going to focus on something possibly that is irrelevant and has nothing whatsoever to do with the issue at hand, just to make the American people think that we're doing something. Mr. President, I also will vote against cloture this evening, and I'm here on the floor to urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I've gotten calls since I landed this morning from Tennessee, from Democratic senators who want to figure out a way to resolve this issue, from people who understand that our country is heading for a train wreck as it relates to our debt ceiling because there haven't been serious negotiations that have taken place. So the senator from Mississippi is right. Believe it or not, in a body that spends $3.7 trillion a year, we haven't had a budget in 797 days. I can't believe that as a citizen. I certainly cannot believe that as a United States Senator. I don't think most citizens in our country realize that we are spending right now $3.7 trillion of our money this year, and we don't even have a budget that's passed. One hasn't even come out of committee, a committee that, by the way, not to be pejorative here, but has a majority of people on the other side of the aisle that could easily, if they wanted to, just pass a budget out to the Senate floor to be debated. So I know sometimes things are difficult to get done around here, but certainly it's difficult to address the number one issue that we have before us in our country, these huge deficits which are creating this issue of the debt ceiling that, quote, has to be raised. And the fact is, again, we're possibly this evening getting ready to move to an issue that is totally irrelevant, very important, and certainly something that's been mishandled tremendously, but certainly something that whatever action we take this week in the Senate is going to be unaffected. It's not going to have any effect on it whatsoever, other than senators feeling good about the fact that they did something that actually ends up bearing no fruit. So, Mr. President, our presiding officer, I urge people on both sides of the aisle to vote against cloture, to take this issue up that we're in a third war, a war that the President doesn't want to call a war by saying that we're not involved in hostilities. Obviously we are. We have predators doing what predators do. When we have aircraft bombing military installations, if North Korea were in our country bombing military installations and using predators to do what predators do, I think we would say that that is hostilities. And no doubt we're involved in hostilities, and that issue should not be left aside and undealt with. But again, today, the big issue, the issue of the day, is our debt ceiling. The issue is our debt. The issue is that we don't have a balanced budget. The issue is that we don't have a fiscal straitjacket to cause us to act responsibly. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote no this evening for cloture. Let's not take up an issue that will have no effect on, that has nothing to do with the debt ceiling, and let's move to those kinds of issues that will. I know that there isn't a budget, unfortunately, to debate at present. It's my understanding the chairman of the Budget Committee is going to unveil some plans. That would be wonderful. There are some budget process issues that are at least relevant to the topic at hand. So, Mr. President, I urge people to vote no this evening. I thank you for the courtesy of time, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I understand that our leader, Senator McConnell, has asked that we speak for no more than 10 minutes, but I would like to ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to speak for 25 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, our debate today takes place in the context of deep economic uncertainty at home, coupled with extraordinary dangers overseas. Our country is suffering from high unemployment, with 9.1% of Americans out of work,
many for years. Our national debt stands well above $14 trillion, and our credit rating is in doubt. Gas prices are still near $4 a gallon in many locations. The number of Americans requiring food stamp assistance has reached 45 million. Some businesses are returning to profitability, but long-term economic growth is threatened by numerous forces, including the skyrocketing national debt, declining home values, high energy costs, and increased competition for export markets. Overseas, almost 100,000 American military personnel are fighting a difficult war in Afghanistan, and more than 1,600 of our troops have been killed in Afghanistan, with roughly 12,000 wounded. Meanwhile, we still have 46,000 troops in Iraq, a deployment that has cost almost 4,500 American lives, with more than 32,000 wounded. Our troops have experienced multiple deployments over the last 8 years that have strained our armed forces. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula are extremely high, with no resolution to the problem of North Korea's nuclear program. We continue to pursue international support for steps that could prevent Iran's nuclear program from producing a nuclear weapon. We remain concerned about stability in Pakistan and the security of that country's nuclear arsenal. We are attempting to counter terrorist threats emanating from Pakistan, East Africa, Yemen, and many other locations. Into this confluence of economic and national security commitments, the President has involved our nation in a civil war in Libya. We find ourselves in a situation where Congress is debating vast cuts in domestic programs to make essential progress on the deficit, even as President Obama has initiated an expensive, open-ended military commitment in a country that his defense secretary said is not of vital interest. Any member who has been here to witness the last 10 years should understand that war is an inherently precarious enterprise that is conducive to accidents, to unintended consequences, and to miscalculations. The last 10 years have also illuminated clearly that initiating wars and killing the enemy is far easier than achieving political stability and reconstructing a country when the fighting is over. This is why going to war should be based on U.S. vital interests. It is also why Congress has an essential role to play in scrutinizing executive branch rationalizations of wars and their ongoing mismanagement. This holds true no matter who is president or which war is being fought. The President has stated that he intervened in Libya in conjunction with the international community to save lives that would have been lost had Gaddafi's forces been left unchecked. But saving lives alone cannot be our standard for using military force. There is no end to the global humanitarian emergencies in which United States military and economic power might be devoted. Saying that American military power in Libya is morally justified is not the same thing as saying it is wise. There are many other questions that must be answered in a disciplined examination of whether to go to war. The administration placed much weight on expressions of approval by the United Nations and the Arab League. It is better to have international support than not when considering war. But neither of those institutions is determinative to an assessment of the United States' vital interests. Even after Gaddafi leaves power, we will be at risk of substantial costs. Already NATO has called for a UN peacekeeping force to be deployed on the ground in Libya to help secure a transitional government. As the largest contributor to the United Nations, the United States probably will bear a significant share of that cost, even if no American troops participate. What follows Gaddafi's regime will be a true nation-building exercise. Despite massive natural resources, Libya was a poor and largely undeveloped country before the first NATO bomb fell. We have been assured that the Libyans will have the financial resources to pay for this reconstruction effort, but we have heard this assurance before. We have had ample experience during the last decade with the difficulties of reconstructing nations in which we have intervened. In justifying our intervention in Libya's civil war, the President has claimed that failure to do so would have emboldened other dictators to resort to violence in the face of popular protests. At a minimum, the unfolding tragedy in Syria is evidence that our intervention in Libya has done little, if anything, to deter such repression. In fact, I think it's more likely that dictators such as Bashar al-Assad have learned the opposite lesson from the Libyan example. That lesson is do not let an opposition force gain control of territory, or the West might intervene to protect it from the sky. And in this thinking, behind the Syrian government's brutal military takeover of the cities, or is this the thinking of the Syrians as they take over the cities? At the same time, our Libyan involvement has made it more difficult to obtain Security Council action of any sort, even rhetorical, against the Syrian regime. American intervention in Libya did not come as a result of a disciplined assessment of our vital interests or an authorization debate in Congress. In the broader strategic context that I've described, a civil war in Libya is not a priority that required American military and economic investments. It is an expensive diversion that leaves the United States and our European allies with fewer assets to respond to other contingencies. President Obama's assertion that he does not need a congressional authorization to wage war in Libya represents a serious setback to the constitutional limits on presidential war powers. Historians will point out that this is not the first time that a president has gone to war unilaterally. But saying that presidents have exceeded their constitutional authority before is little comfort now. Moreover, the Libya case is the one most likely to be cited the next time President Obama or a future president chooses to take our country to war without congressional approval. Declarations of war are not anachronistic exercises. They force the President to submit his case for war to Congress and the American people. They allow for a robust debate to examine the case, and they help gauge if there is sufficient political support to commit American blood and treasure. And they define the role and strategy of the United States. Neither UN Security Council resolutions nor administration briefings are a substitute for a declaration of war or other deliberate authorizations of military operations. Actions leading up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan at least acknowledged that congressional authorization was vital to initiating and conducting war. Despite deep flaws in the process of authorizing those wars, there was recognition that both required a deliberate affirmative vote by Congress. During this debate, there will be appeals to set aside discussions of war powers issues in favor of expressing support for the military mission underway. We will be asked to send a message to Colonel Gaddafi, notwithstanding our displeasure with President Obama's unilateralism. I understand that one can be for the Libya mission while simultaneously be critical of the President's failure to involve Congress in his decision-making. But I also believe it would be difficult to render a judgment on the Libyan operation without reference to the process failures that have preceded this debate. First, in the long run, the significance of the war powers precedent created by President Obama's unilateral intervention in Libya and his subsequent rationalization for not needing congressional authority may be far more significant than the short-term geopolitical consequences of what happens in Libya. And secondly, we are debating an authorization that the President has taken no affirmative action to seek, that he asserts is not necessary under the Constitution or the War Powers Act, and that presumably will have little impact on his actions. Even if one believes that the President somehow had the legal authority to initiate and to continue U.S. military operations in Libya, it does not mean that going to war without Congress was either wise or helpful to the operation. There was no good reason why President Obama should have failed to seek congressional authorization to go to war in Libya. A few excuses have been offered, ranging from an impending congressional recess to the authority provided by the UN Security Council Resolution 1973. But these excuses do not justify the President's lack of constitutional discipline. 12 days before the United States launched hostilities, I called for the President to seek a declaration of war before taking military action. The Arab League resolution, which is cited as the key event in calculations on the war, was passed a full week before we started launching cruise missiles. There was a time to seek congressional approval, and Congress would have debated a war resolution if the President had presented one. That debate would not have been easy. The President should not be able to avoid constitutional responsibilities merely because engaging the people's representatives is inconvenient or uncertain. If the outcome of a congressional vote on war is in doubt, it is all the more reason why a President should seek a debate. If he does not, he is taking the extraordinary position that his plans for war are too important to be upset by a disapproving vote of the Congress. The founders believed that presidents alone should not be trusted with war-making authority, and they constructed checks against executive unilateralism. James Madison, in a 1797 letter to Thomas Jefferson, stated, and I quote, "The Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrate, that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war and most prone to it. It has accordingly, with studied care, vested the question of war in the legislature." Clearly, that's the end of quote from Madison. Clearly, there are circumstances under which a president might be justified in employing military force without congressional authorization. But as Senator Jim Webb has pointed out systematically, none of the reasons apply to the Libyan case. Our country was not attacked or threatened with an attack. We weren't obligated under a treaty to defend the Libyan people. We were not rescuing Americans or launching a one-time punitive retaliation, nor did the operation require surprise that would have made a public debate impractical. In this case, President Obama made a deliberate decision not to seek congressional authorization of his action, either before it commenced or during the last 3 months. This was a fundamental failure of leadership that placed expedience above constitutional responsibility. Moreover, the highly dubious arguments offered by the Obama administration for not needing congressional approval break new ground in justifying a unilateral presidential decision to use force. The accrual of even more war-making authority in the hands of the executive is not in our country's best interest, especially at a time when our nation is deeply in debt and our military is heavily committed overseas. At the outset of the conflict, the President asserted that U.S. military operations in Libya would be, quote, limited in their nature, duration, and scope, end of quote. 3 months later, these assertions ring hollow. Americans and coalition activities have expanded to an all but declared campaign to drive Gaddafi from power. The administration is unable to specify any applicable limits to the duration of the operations, and the scope has grown from efforts to protect Libyan civilians under imminent threat to obliterating Libya's military arsenal, command and control situations, and leadership apparatus. Most recently, the administration has sought to avoid its obligation under the War Powers Resolution by making the incredible assertion that U.S. military operations in Libya do not constitute hostilities, a view that has been rejected by many supporters of the war. Let us be clear that we are deliberately trying to overthrow the government of Libya with military force. We were instrumental in putting the alliance together. We were the major force behind the UN resolution authorizing the war. We set the table for the NATO operations through an intensive bombing campaign to open the war. Our planes and drones continue to bomb Libya, and most missions flown by Allied pilots are dependent on the intelligence and refueling capabilities that we are providing. The means that we are using to overthrow the Libyan government are limited in the sense that we could be applying more military force to the task, but the goal of the operation is not limited. We are using military force to achieve regime change. Defining these actions as something less than hostilities requires extraordinary legal contortion. Administration analysts focus on questions of whether the United States casualties are likely to occur, thereby minimizing other considerations relevant to the use of force. Such an interpretation would deny Congress a say in other questions that are obviously implicated in decisions to go to war, including the war's impact on U.S. strategic interests, on our relations with other countries, on our ability to meet competing national security priorities. The administration also implies that because Allied nations are flying most of the missions over Libya, the United States operations are not significant enough to require congressional authorization. This characterization underplays the centrality of the U.S. contribution to the NATO operations in Libya. We are contributing 70% of the coalition's intelligence capabilities and the majority of its refueling assets. The fact that we are leaving most of the shooting to other nations does not mean that the United States is not involved in acts of war. If the United States encountered persons performing similar activities in support of al-Qaeda or Taliban operations, we certainly would deem them to be participating in hostilities against us. This state of affairs is at odds with the President's own pronouncements on war powers during his presidential candidacy. For example, in December 2007, he responded to a Boston Globe question by saying, and I quote, "The President does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation." End of quote from President Obama. American combat forces are so efficient at certain types of operations, and over-the-horizon technology is so potent that the use of the military instrument to right wrongs exists as a tremendous temptation for presidents. If we fail to come to grips with this now, I fear that we are setting the stage for presidents to undertake other humanitarian interventions without congressional approval. The President does not have the authority to substitute his judgment for a constitutional process when there is no emergency that threatens the United States and our vital interests. The world is full of examples of local and regional violence in which the United States military could be applied for some altruistic purpose. Under the Constitution, the Congress is vested with the authority to determine which, if any, of these circumstances justify the consequences of American military intervention. The Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate marked up S.J. Res. 20, significantly improving the resolution in several key aspects. First, the committee adopted amendments that Senator Webb and I introduced, establishing legally binding prohibitions on the introduction of American ground troops and contractors into Libya. The original resolution addressed this issue only through non-binding language that the President could have ignored. Second, the committee adopted an amendment I offered requiring specific reports on the Libya operations from the administration on strict deadlines. These deadlines were strengthened further by an amendment from Senator Bob Corker. The original resolution lacked sufficient provisions for congressional oversight of the operations, their costs, and their potential impact on other U.S. national security objectives. Third, I offered an amendment specifying the War Powers Resolution applies to current U.S. military operations in Libya and that continuation of these operations requires congressional authorization. This was adopted by acclamation after members on both sides delivered statements supporting the amendment. In doing so, the committee repudiated the administration's contention that United States operations in Libya do not constitute hostilities and therefore are not subject to the War Powers Resolution. Fourth, the committee adopted a sense of the Congress amendment stating that post-war reconstruction costs should be borne primarily by the Libyan people and Arab League nations. Even with the success of these amendments, S.J. Res. 20 remains overly broad despite its stated purpose of authorizing a limited use of force. Specifically, it contains no meaningful limits on the use of American air assets over Libya. The resolution clearly would give the President the authority to escalate the American role in the bombing campaign. I understand that some members of the Senate may favor that course, but members who have concerns about a re-escalation of the U.S. combat role should understand that passage of the resolution not only gives the President that authority, it makes such a re-escalation more likely. The defining limitation, S.J. Res. 20, is UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which calls on nations to protect Libyan civilians. Effectively, any use of air power consistent with this UN resolution is permitted under S.J. Res. 20. Using Resolution 1973 as justification, the President already engaged in an intense bombing campaign against Libyan targets at the beginning of our intervention. By definition, the administration and our allies would regard S.J. Res. 20 as permitting at least the intensity of American bombing that was undertaken in the first week of the war. Moreover, President Obama publicly has defined the removal of Colonel Gaddafi as in the interest of protecting Libyan civilians. From the administration's point of view, almost any airstrike that degrades Libyan military capabilities or contributes in some way to the potential for the ouster of Gaddafi can be justified as contributing to the protection of civilians. This could include the use of slower fixed-wing aircraft flying close air support missions and perhaps even helicopters. Passage of this resolution does not guarantee that there will be a full-scale re-escalation, but if President Obama is armed with this resolution, and if the Libyan operation drags on, it is almost inevitable that the American role in Libya will expand. We know that some of our allies are running short of ammunition. We also know that public opinion in some allied nations may trend against continuing this mission. Our military is the best and most capable in the world. If the President has this broad authorization from Congress in hand, allies will be far more confident that the United States will pick up the slack if they withdraw or limit their participation. In a recent press conference, the President said, and I quote, "There's no risk of additional escalation," end of quote. But the only barrier to escalation would be the decision-making of the President himself. I do not believe that our intervention in Libya civil war was prudent in the context of U.S. vital interests. I continue to be concerned that the United States role in Libya will escalate, that Libya's reconstruction burdens could fall on our country, and that the Libyan operation siphons attention and resources away from more important national security priorities. I cannot support the broad mandate that this resolution would give to the President to expand U.S. military activities over Libya. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing adoption of S.J. Res. 20. I thank the Chair, and I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.